Welcome to this Paper Connections investigation. Today we examine a trending and widely read essay, Propaganda, the Man Who Manipulated the 20th Century. To fully set the stage and immerse us in the surroundings of this history, I will now read the author's prologue. On the evening of the 21st of October, 1929, at a few minutes past 7 o'clock, an old man in a reconstructed laboratory in Dearborn, Michigan, bent over a workbench and joined two wires, and across the United States, the lights went out and came back on. They'd gone out on purpose. For the preceding hour, on the instruction of radio announcers carried on as many as 140 stations, families in San Francisco and Charleston and the small towns of the plains had stood with their hands on the switches in their parlors, waiting, and at the signal that the elderly Thomas Edison had reenacted 50 years on the first lighting of his incandescent lamp, they turned their own lights off, paused in the dark, and turned them on again together. It was the largest synchronized act in the history of the Republic to that date, and almost no one taking part in it understood that they were not, in any meaningful sense, celebrating Thomas Edison. They were inside a campaign. The man who had built the campaign was not in the room in Dearborn. He was a 38-year-old publicist in New York, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and he had already given the thing he did for a living a name that should have frightened the country more than it did. He called it the engineering of consent. The country that turned its lights off and on that night thought it was honoring an old man in Dearborn. No one told them they were the ones being switched on and off.
The profound implications of that opening scene, they rest upon a singular biographical detail, a sort of genealogical arithmetic that quietly shaped the entire 20th century. Edward Bernays was born in Vienna in November of 1891, and his eventual entry into the high-stakes world of influence was facilitated by an extraordinary double knot of blood and marriage. His mother was the sister of Sigmund Freud, and his father's sister was married to Sigmund Freud. By the sheer mathematics of his lineage, Bernays was the nephew of the founder of psychoanalysis twice over.
That biological link granted him an unassailable intellectual credential, which he utilized quite ruthlessly. He possessed the unique ability to utter the phrase, "my Uncle Sigmund," not merely as a point of trivial familial pride, but as an impenetrable shield of authority in the emerging marketplace of mass persuasion. He recognized long before his contemporaries the enormous commercial value of his uncle's theoretical framework regarding the unconscious mind. He was essentially selling access to the deepest workings of the human mind, and he presented himself as the sole authorized broker.
We must analyze the philosophical divergence between the uncle and the nephew, because it represents a monumental pivot in the application of psychological science. Sigmund Freud painstakingly mapped the human subconscious, charting the murky territories of buried desires, repressed shame, and psychological substitution. But his primary objective was individual healing. He sought to liberate the patient from the invisible forces dictating their behavior, dragging the hidden traumas into the light of conscious rationality. Bernays, observing this exact same map of the human psyche, interpreted it not as a clinical tool, but as an industrial instrument.
That distinction is paramount to understanding his entire career. He reasoned that if an individual's conscious explanations for their actions are merely after-the-fact rationalizations for deeper, hidden drives, then a multiplication of individuals into a public operates under identical mechanics. By addressing the hidden motive rather than the stated reason, Bernays deduced that human populations could be moved reliably and at a continental scale. He effectively transitioned the psychoanalytic framework from the intimate, confidential setting of the therapist's couch to the vast, unregulated expanse of the commercial marketplace.
This theoretical realization required a proving ground, which materialized with America's entry into the First World War in April of 1917. President Woodrow Wilson established the Committee on Public Information, entrusting its operation to a journalist named George Creel, and we need to examine the microscopic narrative engine of this apparatus. The Creel Committee operated with staggering mechanical efficiency, effectively inventing modern state propaganda. They distributed over 6,000 specialized press releases to shape the daily news cycle, determining precisely what the public read over the morning coffee.
The sheer scale of their operation was unprecedented. They mobilized an army of 75,000 volunteer orators, known as the 4-Minute Men, who were trained to deliver highly standardized, emotionally charged speeches in cinemas and public halls across the nation during the time it took to change a film reel. Furthermore, their division of pictorial publicity harnessed the talents of leading commercial illustrators to visually engineer patriotism. This specifically resulted in James Montgomery Flagg's enduring poster of a stern, finger-pointing Uncle Sam systematically transforming a hesitant, neutral population into a mobilized, belligerent national consensus.
Bernays participated intimately in this vast machinery within the Foreign Press Bureau, and the experience crystallized a chilling revelation in his mind. He observed that the highly systematic techniques utilized to raise armies, float war bonds, and demonize adversaries did not magically cease to function upon the signing of the armistice. He deduced that the propaganda of wartime mobilization could be seamlessly transitioned into the commercial operations of peacetime. The underlying methodology remained intact, merely the client required substitution.
However, he faced an immediate and severe branding crisis upon returning to the private sector. The term propaganda had acquired a deeply toxic odor, entirely contaminated by the psychological warfare and staggering casualties of the global conflict. Recognizing that respectable corporations required a respectable nomenclature to obscure their intentions, Bernays engineered a brilliant linguistic camouflage. He rebranded his discipline as public relations, successfully neutralizing the toxicity of his methods and embedding them invisibly into the fabric of modern institutional governance.
Consider a comparative illustration to fully grasp the historical magnitude of this divergence between uncle and nephew. We can conceptualize Sigmund Freud as the theoretical physicist who uncovers the fundamental, unseen laws governing atomic energy, whose work is primarily descriptive, illuminating the hidden structures of reality. Edward Bernays, conversely, functions as the applied engineer who studies those newly discovered laws and realizes they can be harnessed mechanically. The engineer understands that the identical atomic principles can be utilized to construct a municipal power plant to illuminate a city, or to manufacture a devastating weapon to obliterate it.
That is a very precise analogy. Bernays perceived the subconscious not as a realm requiring therapeutic liberation, but as a utility grid waiting to be tapped, channeled, and ultimately monetized for whichever client possessed the necessary capital to hire his firm. This theoretical foundation found its first major application upon the highest office in the nation, moving our investigation from the abstract mechanics of public relations directly into the manipulation of the American presidency. By the autumn of 1924, President Calvin Coolidge faced an intractable political dilemma.
His vulnerability was not a matter of failed policy or severe economic distress, but rather a profound, debilitating deficit of personality. Assuming the presidency following the sudden death of Warren G. Harding, Coolidge was universally known as Silent Cal, a man so famously devoid of demonstrative warmth that a popular national joke suggested he looked as though he had been weaned on a pickle. In an era where mass circulation magazines and the wireless radio were rapidly transforming a politician's personal demeanor into a matter of national consequence, Coolidge's rigid, austere image posed a severe electoral threat.
The meticulous architectural construction of the event Bernays designed to solve this crisis deserves our utmost scrutiny. On the morning of October 17, 1924, Bernays did not orchestrate a policy address. He orchestrated a highly publicized breakfast on the south lawn of the White House. He arranged for a carefully curated party of 40 prominent Broadway actors and entertainers to dine with the president. The delegation was led by Al Jolson, the era's most universally beloved entertainer.
The inclusion of such vibrant personalities was a masterstroke of environmental contrast. Jolson was accompanied by luminaries such as the established stage actor John Drew, the highly popular Dolly Sisters, and the comedian Charlotte Greenwood. They were joined by Ray Miller's jazz band, marking the historic first time a jazz ensemble performed at the Executive Mansion. The menu itself was deliberately selected to evoke rural American warmth and approachability, featuring griddle cakes, Vermont maple syrup, sausages, and bacon.
Following the meal, Al Jolson led the entire assembly in a campaign song specifically composed for the occasion, cheerfully titled, "Keep Coolidge." The survival of the archival documentation for this event provides us with an extraordinary window into the origins of modern political manipulation. Preserved within the Library of Congress, nestled among the immense collection of the Edward L. Bernays papers, lies an 11-page carbon-copied typescript, encased in a simple gray folder.
Examining that artifact is a chilling experience for any historian. It details the exact, minute-by-minute choreography of the breakfast campaign, including the complete lyrics to the song Keep Coolidge. It survives as the literal physical blueprint for the modern political image campaign. It allows us to view the event not merely through the lens of historical outcome, but directly from the desk of the architect who systematically planned the emotional manipulation of the electorate.
The philosophical genius of this operation resides entirely in Bernays' mastery of indirection. At no point during this campaign did he attempt to argue the merits of Calvin Coolidge's political platform, nor did he issue defensive press statements insisting the president was secretly a warm and jovial individual. Instead, he fundamentally altered the environment surrounding the man. By ensuring that photographs of a smiling President Coolidge, flanked by the nation's most cherished entertainers, dominated the front pages of newspapers nationwide, Bernays circumvented the public's rational, critical faculties.
The electorate unconsciously synthesized the imagery, reasoning independently that a man capable of sharing griddle cakes and laughter with L. Jolson could not possibly be a cold, unfeeling cipher. Bernays allowed the public to construct the desired conclusion, securing their conviction by making them the authors of their own persuasion. Transitioning from the bespoke manipulation of a singular political figure, we need to analyze how these exact mechanisms were weaponized against the broad American subconscious to engineer mass consumer behavior.
On March 31st, 1929, Bernays executed a campaign that remains a masterclass in the commercial subversion of genuine social movements. George Washington Hill, the notoriously demanding president of the American Tobacco Company, manufacturer of Lucky Strike cigarettes, presented Bernays with a structural commercial barrier. The societal norms of the era strictly prohibited women from smoking in public, viewing it as highly improper. Hill recognized that this unwritten taboo effectively sequestered half of the adult population from his product.
Hill did not seek a clever advertising slogan. He demanded the total eradication of a deep-seated societal prohibition so his market share could instantly double. To deconstruct this taboo, Bernays bypassed the traditional advertising agencies entirely, and instead he sought counsel from the realm of psychoanalysis. He consulted A. Brill, the prominent American analyst who had translated Freud's works into English, seeking a deeper psychological framework for the campaign.
The psychological framing Brill provided was foundational to the entire operation. He hypothesized that, within the female unconscious, the cigarette functioned as a phallic symbol of male power and absolute authority, a symbol from which women were denied access by societal design. Brill suggested that if the cigarette could be deeply equated with the concept of emancipation, it would cease to be merely a rolled cylinder of tobacco. It would sublimate into a torch of freedom.
Bernays seized upon this profound psychological insight with terrifying efficiency. He determined that he would not sell the physical product to the female consumer, he would sell the franchise of the body. He intended to utilize the profound momentum of the recently victorious women's suffrage movement to smuggle a highly addictive substance into their daily habits. The step-by-step mechanics of the Easter parade stunt reveal a meticulous orchestration of deceit.
He tasked his personal secretary, Bertha Hunt, to dispatch telegrams to a carefully selected list of prominent debutantes, sourced discreetly from a contact at Vogue magazine. Crucially, these invitations never once mentioned the American Tobacco Company, Lucky Strike, or Bernays himself. They invited these young women to strike a blow for equality by marching down Fifth Avenue during the highly visible Easter parade and igniting torches of freedom. To ensure the event carried authentic ideological weight, he secured the participation of the prominent feminist Ruth Hale, who championed the cause of women keeping their maiden names.
Furthermore, Bernays strategically positioned his own hired photographers along the parade route, guaranteeing that the precise moment of ignition was captured from the most dramatic and advantageous angles. These images were ready for immediate syndication to the global press. The unprecedented success of the operation was cemented by the total camouflage of its commercial origins. On April 1st, the New York Times published a prominent headline describing a group of girls puffing at cigarettes as a spontaneous gesture of freedom.
The debutantes, adhering perfectly to their briefing, echoed the exact phrase "torches of freedom" to the assembled reporters. The press, entirely oblivious to the hidden corporate orchestration, framed the event strictly as an act of feminist defiance. The public consumed a narrative of social liberation, fundamentally unaware that they were digesting a meticulously funded tobacco promotion. We must also note a microscopic detail of profound hypocrisy that contextualizes the architect's personal morality.
In his private life, Bernays was acutely aware of the physical dangers of the product he promoted so vigorously. He actively forbade his own wife, Doris Fleischman, from smoking, frequently searching out and hiding her cigarettes. He even explicitly instructed his daughters to break them in half if they found them. He engineered the chemical addiction of a generation of women while fiercely protecting his own household from the very same affliction.
This methodology of manipulating authoritative consensus was similarly applied to fundamentally alter the dietary habits of the American public. Prior to 1922, the standard American breakfast was a relatively light affair, typically consisting of a roll, fresh fruit, and coffee, which reflected a societal shift towards sedentary urban labor. The Beechnut Packing Company approached Bernays grappling with stagnant bacon sales, requiring a shift in national consumption patterns.
Employing the mechanism of the credentialed third party, Bernays directed his agency's staff physician to inquire formally whether a heavy breakfast was biologically superior to a light one. Upon receiving the predictable affirmation from a doctor on his payroll, he expanded the scope dramatically, initiating a survey of 5,000 medical professionals across the country. Roughly 4,500 doctors confirmed that a robust morning meal was scientifically desirable to sustain energy throughout the day.
The distribution of this manufactured consensus was a triumph of indirect placement. Bernays did not route this medical information through clearly labeled paid advertising channels. Instead, he placed the findings within the Medical Review of Reviews, a legitimate journal he had previously edited. By doing this, he successfully laundered the commercial intent through the unimpeachable veneer of medical science.
From there, major publications such as the Chicago Tribune amplified the narrative, publishing articles advising brain workers to consume heavier breakfasts and helpfully suggesting bacon and eggs as the ideal components. The public, believing they were responding to independent, objective medical advice from the nation's doctors, beautifully altered their purchasing habits. Through this hidden process, bacon and eggs became so deeply embedded within the cultural fabric that subsequent generations assumed it had been the traditional American breakfast since the nation's founding. Now, you have to consider the scale of this. He did not run an advertisement for bacon. He altered the definition of breakfast itself.
When you examine this sequence of events, you must confront the profound violation of human autonomy at the center of these campaigns. The American public was never coerced by force to ignite a cigarette on Fifth Avenue, nor were they mandated by law to consume a heavy breakfast of cured meats. Instead, their internal landscapes, their very desires and perceptions of health and liberation, were systematically re-engineered by hidden actors.
The manipulation was so flawless, so entirely frictionless, that the populations executing these manufactured behaviors experienced their actions as pure expressions of their own free will. The invisible government Bernays described did not operate through tyranny or threats of violence. It operated by hijacking the very mechanisms of choice, rendering the concept of autonomous informed consent practically obsolete. We have to transition our focus from the sunny, domestic manipulation of 1920s America to a significantly darker horizon, examining how these exact psychological levers were simultaneously being operated by totalitarian regimes in Europe.
The era of manufactured American optimism reached its absolute zenith in October 1929 with an event titled Light's Golden Jubilee. The General Electric Company sought to canonize Thomas Edison, intending to inextricably bind its corporate identity to the nation's most revered inventor. Bernays constructed a campaign of staggering, unprecedented scale, successfully lobbying the Postmaster General to issue a 2-cent commemorative stamp, effectively printing his client's promotion onto the nation's official mail.
He orchestrated a live broadcast across 140 radio stations, centering the drama on Henry Ford's meticulous recreation of the Menlo Park Laboratory in Dearborn, Michigan. The guest list was a constellation of global power, featuring President Herbert Hoover, John D. Rockefeller, Marie Curie, and Albert Einstein participating via a transatlantic radio link. The historical irony embedded within this spectacle is overwhelming, as the synchronized extinguishing and reigniting of lights across the Republic was experienced by the public as an act of profound, quasi-religious national reverence.
Yet it was the ultimate pseudo-event, the absolute peak of an engineered emotional prosperity. Precisely 3 days following this monumental display of collective optimism, on October 24, 1929, the New York stock market suffered its catastrophic collapse, plunging the world into the Great Depression. The meticulously crafted atmosphere of confidence, fueled for a decade by the very mechanisms of public relations, had propelled the speculative bubble to its breaking point.
The optimism had been entirely manufactured, built on psychological levers rather than economic reality, and the public was left to pay the devastating cost of a reality that could no longer be deferred or managed by a press release. The realization that the framework of human manipulation holds no moral allegiance is clarified by a deeply disturbing encounter documented in Bernays' own memoirs. In 1933, he hosted a dinner party in his home where he conversed with Karl von Weigand, a veteran Hearst foreign correspondent recently returned from his assignment in Germany.
Weigand recounted an interview he had conducted with Joseph Goebbels, the architect of Nazi propaganda. Weigand informed his host that Goebbels possessed a vast, meticulously studied library on mass persuasion. Prominently featured on Goebbels' desk was Bernays' own foundational 1923 text, Crystallizing Public Opinion. Goebbels was actively, systematically utilizing the methodologies codified by the Jewish nephew of Sigmund Freud to engineer the psychological persecution and eventual destruction of the German Jewish population.
This forces us to examine the deep intellectual lineage shared by both the American publicist and the fascist propagandist, as both factions drew from the exact same theoretical wellspring. They both deeply studied Gustave Le Bon's 19th century analysis of crowd psychology, which posited the collective as a reactive, unreasoning beast driven by primitive emotion rather than intellect. They both absorbed Wilfred Trotter's theories on the human herd instinct, recognizing the overwhelming biological power of social conformity.
To this foundation, they appended Freud's mapping of the unconscious mind. This combined intellectual inheritance served both the American showman selling soap and the European architect of annihilation. The framework was merely a description of human vulnerability. It offered no resistance to the hands that wielded it, functioning with terrifying mechanical efficiency, whether displayed for consumerism or genocide.
The tragic culmination of this intellectual convergence centers on the agonizing fate of Sigmund Freud himself in March of 1938. As German troops marched in and annexed Austria, the 81-year-old Freud, suffering the painful late stages of advanced jaw cancer, found himself effectively trapped within his apartment at Berggasse 19 in Vienna. The very mind that had illuminated the unconscious forces now weaponized by the Third Reich was paralyzed by the mechanized application of his own theories.
His immense global fame offered little immediate protection against a regime that operated on the principles of manufactured mass hysteria and systemic eradication. The rescue of this monumental intellect required intricate diplomatic maneuvering and vast financial resources entirely separate from the academic world he inhabited. The granular details of Freud's extraction highlight the brutal ironies of the era.
His release from Vienna was strictly contingent upon the payment of the Reichssteuer, the extortionate Reich flight tax, designed specifically to strip fleeing Jewish citizens of their entire accumulated assets. This monumental ransom was not paid by international academic institutions or governments, but by the private fortune of Marie Bonaparte. She was a Greek and Danish princess, a former psychoanalytic patient of Freud's, and the great-grandniece of Napoleon Bonaparte.
While Bernays thrived in New York, reaping vast fortunes by operating the commercial variant of psychoanalytic theory, the author of that theory was forced to rely on aristocratic patronage to purchase his survival from a regime that was utilizing the darker iteration of his life's work. It is a profound, horrifying demonstration of a theoretical framework entirely escaping the control and the intent of its creator. To complete the examination of the war years, we need to analyze how the American state eventually deployed these exact mechanisms in combat, notably excluding their primary architect.
Throughout the Second World War, Bernays was purposefully sidelined by the Roosevelt administration. Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter explicitly warned the president against employing him, officially categorizing Bernays as a professional poisoner of the public mind. Consequently, the psychological warfare was conducted by the Office of Strategic Services, and we must dissect the microscopic detail of Operation Cornflakes in 1945.
The OSS systematically bombed German mail trains. Subsequently, operatives dropped sacks of expertly forged letters amidst the flaming wreckage to ensure they would be gathered and delivered by unwitting postal workers to German citizens. The operational masterpiece of this campaign was the forged 12 Pfennig stamp, where the profile of Adolf Hitler was subtly altered to resemble a skeletal death's head.
The standard inscription, Deutsches Reich, was meticulously modified to read Fuchsches Reich, meaning the ruined empire. It was the engineering of consent, stripped of its polite commercial veneer, weaponized directly for existential conflict. Moving into the Cold War era, we have to confront the application of these potent techniques against the sovereign governance of a foreign democracy.
The theater was Guatemala, and the client was the United Fruit Company, a singular corporation that effectively operated the Central American nation as a private, highly profitable fiefdom. They held an absolute monopoly over the railways, the port infrastructure, the telegraph networks, and vast tracts of uncultivated, highly fertile land. They possessed a deep historical fluency in public manipulation, having decades earlier published a pamphlet titled Food Value of the Banana.
They utilized the familiar Bernaysian tactic of credentialed scientific endorsement to manufacture American dietary demand for an unfamiliar tropical fruit. The geopolitical landscape shifted dramatically with the Democratic Revolution of 1944 and the subsequent 1951 election of President Jacobo Arbenz. Arbenz represented an existential threat to the corporate monopoly as he initiated a comprehensive popular land reform program designed to expropriate the vast reserves of idle land held by United Fruit, distributing it to landless peasants.
The mechanism of compensation he proposed was a masterstroke of administrative irony. The Guatemalan government offered to compensate the corporation based precisely on the artificially low property values the company itself had fraudulently declared on its own tax returns for years to avoid taxation. Viewing this legal maneuver as outright theft of their assets, the United Fruit Company mobilized its vast resources.
They enlisted the services of Edward Bernays, retaining him at an astronomical fee of $100,000 annually, specifically to dismantle the public standing of the Guatemalan president within the United States. Bernays' strategy in this theater is a chilling study in macro-environmental manipulation. Retaining his massive fee, he entirely avoided debating the nuances of agrarian reform, international law, or corporate taxation, understanding those arguments were tedious and unwinnable.
Instead, he simply changed the atmospheric conditions of the narrative. He systematically engineered the perception that Guatemala was no longer a struggling republic seeking economic independence, but a forward operating base for Soviet communism situated a mere 90 minutes from the Panama Canal. He constructed the Middle America Information Bureau, an ostensibly neutral front organization, to flood editorial desks across America with carefully curated alarmist intelligence.
Furthermore, he orchestrated highly sanitized, heavily managed junkets for influential journalists from publications like the New York Times and Time magazine. He ensured they observed only what the corporation desired, allowing corporate propaganda to be laundered into the American consciousness as objective foreign correspondence. The culmination of this psychological groundwork was the execution of Operation PBSCS in June 1954.
Under the direct authorization of the Eisenhower administration, the Central Intelligence Agency orchestrated a multifaceted coup d'etat. They utilized a small exile force commanded by Colonel Castillo Armas, but the true weapon was psychological. The CIA systematically jammed the legitimate Guatemalan government's radio broadcasts, replacing them with the Voice of Liberation, a clandestine station broadcasting fabricated bulletins of overwhelming rebel victories, mass desertions, and imminent governmental collapse.
The Guatemalan military, its morale eroded by the manufactured illusion of inevitability rather than actual military defeat, refused to defend the president. The aftermath of this engineered perception was a generational catastrophe. On June 27th, Arbenz was forced into resignation and exile, repeatedly humiliated, photographed being stripped to his underwear at the airport, and eventually dying in a bathtub in Mexico City in 1971, under circumstances of profound despair.
Castillo Armas was installed as a compliant dictator, immediately returning the expropriated lands to the United Fruit Company and violently annihilating the labor unions. This intervention fractured the nation, plunging Guatemala into a horrific 36-year civil war. The subsequent Truth Commission documented the staggering human cost, revealing over 200,000 people slaughtered.
The vast majority of the dead were indigenous Mayan peasants, targeted in brutal counterinsurgency campaigns that historians and legal scholars have definitively classified as acts of genocide. The blood of this conflict is inextricably linked to the atmosphere of fear meticulously constructed in an office in New York. To fully grasp the historical weight of these events, we must step back and engage with the historiography, examining the granular debate concerning causality.
We have the foundational revisionist account provided by Stephen Schlesinger and Stephen Kinzer in their work, Bitter Fruit. Their analysis places a heavy, nearly exclusive burden of blame upon the machinations of the United Fruit Company and the propaganda genius of Edward Bernays, suggesting that the coup was a direct, linear product of corporate lobbying. Conversely, we have to consider the rigorous archival study conducted by historian Richard Immerman.
Immerman argues that the Eisenhower administration was deeply submerged in the genuine paranoia of the early Cold War. He posits that they would likely have authorized the intervention based on a sincere, albeit deeply flawed, misinterpretation of Arbenz's nationalist policies, regardless of the corporate public relations campaign. The true historical synthesis lies in the intersection of these perspectives.
Bernays did not possess the executive authority to command the Central Intelligence Agency. He did not physically pull the trigger or order the bombings. However, his contribution was arguably more insidious and foundational. He meticulously, methodically engineered the domestic American atmosphere that permitted that trigger to be pulled without a whisper of public dissent.
He constructed a rigid cognitive framework wherein the destruction of a fragile democracy appeared to the American electorate not as a brutal act of corporate imperialism, but as a necessary and heroic defense against Soviet aggression. He manufactured the consent required for the state to execute his violent prerogatives with absolute impunity. Connecting this lineage requires us to recognize the explicit bibliography that Bernays himself proudly claimed, the foundational texts that enabled this century of manipulation.
He openly drew upon Gustave Le Bon's 1895 work, Psychologie des Fous, which first articulated the irrational, highly suggestible nature of the crowd. He integrated Wilfred Trotter's 1916 analysis, Instincts of the Herd in Peace and War, which detailed the overwhelming biological imperative of social conformity. Finally, he operationalized Sigmund Freud's 1921 text, Mass and Psychology, utilizing the mechanics of unconscious identification.
These three texts form the unholy trinity of modern persuasion, transitioning theoretical psychology into an applied science of societal control, entirely indifferent to whether it sold a breakfast meat or justified a military coup. When you review the specific insights brought forward by the readers of this investigation, the enduring relevance of this history becomes starkly apparent. Consider the observation from the reader identified as Sunshine, who noted with alarm that the fundamental mechanism of persuasion remains entirely agnostic to its objective.
The architecture of manipulation functions with identical efficacy, whether it is selling the illusion of female enfranchisement through cigarettes or reshaping the geopolitical perception of a sovereign government. Furthermore, the reader, Srinivas Perry, astutely connected this historical framework to Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's later, highly influential model in manufacturing consent. This links the psychological orchestration of the 1920s to the broader mechanisms of historical financial delusions and systemic media compliance.
If you absorb the totality of this investigation, you are left with a final, chilling philosophical provocation to consider. Edward Bernays industrialized the human subconscious during an era defined by analog radio, physical print media, and crude, generalized demographic guesswork. The engineering of consent he pioneered was, by modern standards, a remarkably blunt instrument. What then does the engineering of consent look like today?
You exist in an ecosystem where algorithms have perfectly and microscopically mapped your individual psychological profile. These systems possess the capacity to micro-target your deepest anxieties, your insecurities, and your sublimated desires in real time, adapting to your gaze and your hesitations. If the crude tools of the 20th century could orchestrate wars and manipulate the fundamental dietary habits of entire populations, then in an era of absolute digital surveillance, who exactly is holding the matches to your torches of freedom right now? To conclude our investigation and leave you with the author's final reflections, I will now read the epilogue. Edward Bernays lived to be 103. He died in 1995 in Cambridge, Massachusetts, lucid almost to the end, having outlived the century he had helped to shape and very nearly the next one's first decade of self-awareness about what he had done. In his last years, the young men and women who came to interview him found a small, courtly, immensely old man, happy to explain the methods, proud of the cleverness, untroubled in any way that registered on the visitor by the uses to which the methods had been put. He had taught a nation to smoke and watched it die of the lesson, and he had not smoked. He had taught a nation to revere an inventor so that it would buy a corporation's bulbs and to love a president it had found cold, and to fear a foreign reformer it had never met. He had written down in 1928 the plainest description anyone has ever given of the machinery, and then he had spent 67 more years operating it, and at no point did the description and the operation appear to trouble each other in his mind. The lights had gone off and on across America at his signal in 1929, and the country had felt it as reverence, and that, to Edward Bernays, was simply what the public was for. The question his life leaves the careful reader is not whether the machinery exists. He told us it exists on the first page of his own book, and named himself its engineer. The question is the one his uncle's theory raises and never answers. If the public is moved at a level beneath the reasons it gives itself, and if the levers are known, and if there will always be someone with the resources to operate them, then what protects the free mind in any week of any year except the small and tiring discipline of noticing the lever as it engages? The cigarette felt like freedom. The breakfast felt like warmth. The lights felt like reverence. The fear of Guatemala felt like vigilance. In every case, the feeling was real and the feeling was made, and the people who held it experienced the making as their own free thought. That is not a problem the 20th century solved. It is the problem the 20th century industrialized and handed unsolved and refined beyond anything Bernays could operate from a single office in New York to the device in your pocket. Watch for the torch that is handed to you as freedom. Someone has usually paid for the matches.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you have enjoyed this investigation, and stay tuned for our next episode.